The summer of 1187 was merciless in the hills of Galilee, where the kingdom of Jerusalem gathered its remaining strength under the banner of the true cross, marching toward the waters of Tiberias, only to find themselves ensnared by the genius of Saladin. At the horns of Hattin, the Crusader army, parched, weary, and blinded by smoke from fires deliberately set in the dry grass, was encircled and broken, its knights slaughtered or taken captive, its king, Guy of Lusignan, dragged into chains, and its most sacred relics seized as a trophy for Islam. In the wake of this catastrophe, the fortresses of the Holy Land fell one by one, and in October, Saladin himself entered Jerusalem in triumph, sparing the population but stripping the city of its Frankish defenders. For the Christians of the West, this was no ordinary defeat. It was an apocalyptic disaster, a reversal of all the victories won since the First Crusade, and the news spread across Europe with the speed and terror of a wildfire consuming dry fields, calling forth lamentations from churches and monasteries alike, and setting the stage for a new holy war. The kings take the cross. From the heart of Christendom came an answer of unprecedented magnitude, as Pope Gregory VIII's bull, Audita Tremendi, called kings as well as knights to reclaim the city of Christ, and 3 monarchs rose in response, their reputations shaping the destiny of the crusade before it had even begun. The first was Frederick Barbarossa, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, a grizzled veteran of 70 years whose iron will had forged order across Germany and Italy, and who now marshaled a massive host that dwarfed all others. The second was Philip II Augustus of France, cold, shrewd, and politically calculating, a man whose ambitions stretched as much toward Europe as toward the Holy Land. And the third was Richard I of England, newly crowned and already styled the Lionheart, a restless warrior king driven by a hunger for eternal fame. When Barbarossa set out across Anatolia, his army crushed the Seljuk Turks at Iconium and seemed unstoppable. Yet destiny turned cruel when, in June 1190, the emperor drowned in a sudden accident while fording a river, leaving his vast force leaderless and demoralized, scattering to the winds until only a few thousand carried his bones onward in a barrel of vinegar. With Barbarossa gone, the fate of the crusade narrowed to the rivalry and uneasy cooperation of Richard and Philip, whose ships would soon sail toward the burning coast of Syria, the Siege of Acre. By the time the Western kings arrived, the Holy Land was locked in a grotesque stalemate at the walls of Acre, the great port city that Guy of Lusignan had besieged since 1189, where crusaders encircled the garrison, while Saladin's armies encircled the crusaders in turn, a double noose that strangled both sides with hunger, pestilence, and unrelenting attrition. The camps reeked with disease, corpses, and filth, as knights and common soldiers alike died not in glory but in misery, their bodies rotting in shallow pits, their spirits tested by despair. Richard arrived in June 1191, burning with fever yet determined to bring victory, and unleash the full fury of his siege engines, massive trebuchets that hurled boulders and fire into the crumbling walls, while Philip's engineers joined in the relentless bombardment. After months of terror, the garrison surrendered on July 12th. But when Saladin delayed fulfilling the terms of ransom, Richard answered with ruthless resolve, ordering the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners before the very eyes of their countrymen. It was a brutal message to Saladin and a warning to his own men. The Lionheart's will would not be thwarted, and mercy would never outweigh strategy. Rival kings. The fall of Acre might have marked the beginning of a unified campaign, yet within days the fragile alliance of kings fractured, for Richard and Philip were not brothers in arms, but bitter rivals whose enmities reached back to Europe, where the question of lands, loyalties, and Plantagenet dominion poisoned all trust. Richard's charisma, his daring in battle, and his dramatic gestures made him the darling of the crusading host, overshadowing Philip, who brooded at the English king's arrogance and dominance in councils of war. Resentment festered into open conflict over spoils, rights to Acre, and the inheritance of the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself, until the French king, feigning illness and weariness, abandoned the crusade and sailed back to France, leaving Richard alone to carry the weight of Christendom's hopes. The Lionheart, undeterred, seized command, aware that while his rival's departure gave him freedom, it also left him with the crushing responsibility of confronting Saladin without the full strength that had once been promised by Europe's rulers. The march to Arsuf. In August 1191, Richard began his bold march south from Acre, his army moving in a disciplined column along the coast while the fleet shadowed them by sea, supplying food and water and guarding against ambush, a maneuver that revealed his genius for logistics and strategy. Day after day, Saladin's cavalry swarmed the flanks, loosing arrows, screaming war cries, and darting away before the Crusaders could respond, testing their discipline to the breaking point. Yet Richard held his knights in iron restraint, forbidding them to charge prematurely and urging them to endure the storm. The march became a grueling trial of nerves, a walking battlefield where exhaustion threatened to undo them, until on September 7th at Arsuf, Saladin committed his full army in a massive assault near the cover of the forest. For hours, the Crusaders endured the hail of arrows, until the Hospitallers, bleeding and desperate, charged without orders. And in that instant, Richard transformed their disobedience into triumph, commanding the full line to advance. With lances leveled and banners flying, the knights thundered forward, smashing into the Muslim cavalry with irresistible force, breaking Saladin's army and sending it fleeing in chaos. The victory at Arsuf resounded across the world. Richard had done what no Frank had achieved since Hattin. He had beaten Saladin in open battle, the shadow of Jerusalem. After Arsuf, the Crusaders pushed inland, their spirits lifted and their hopes fixed on Jerusalem until they stood within 12 miles of the holy city, close enough that the towers were said to be visible on the horizon, and pilgrims wept with joy at the thought of its imminent liberation. Yet here Richard made the hardest decision of his life, for he knew that to besiege Jerusalem without secure supply lines in a land Saladin had stripped bare was to risk total annihilation, and so he called a halt. The army's joy turned to bitterness, morale crumbled, and whispers spread that the Lionheart was too cautious or too worldly to claim Christ's sepulchre. Still, Richard refused to gamble the entire crusade on a desperate stroke. Instead, he turned his energy to rebuilding coastal fortresses like Jaffa and Ascalon, creating a chain of strongholds that could sustain the Crusader presence for generations, while Saladin, equally cunning, razed villages and poisoned wells to deny the enemy any hope of feeding an invasion. It was a duel not of swords but of endurance and calculation, and in this shadow war, Richard's fire collided with Saladin's patience, each man trying to outlast the other. The last campaign. By 1192, both leaders were near exhaustion, their realms strained by war and their bodies weakened by endless toil. Yet the struggle flared again when Saladin struck at Jaffa, seizing the town but failing to capture its citadel, which stood defiant like a tooth against the tide. Richard, far to the north, gathered barely 50 knights and launched one of the most daring feats of medieval warfare, sailing south, leaping ashore, and charging through the surf into the astonished enemy camp, scattering soldiers in panic and rallying the defenders. Days later, Saladin returned with his full force, hurling wave after wave of cavalry against Richard's thin line. But the Lionheart's men, disciplined and resolute, formed tight ranks, their crossbowmen loosing deadly volleys that tore through the enemy horses and riders until the Sultan's army wavered. At that moment, Richard himself led a thunderous charge, cutting a path through the foe and driving them into retreat. It was his final victory, a spectacle of audacity and brilliance that left even his enemies in awe. But it could not change the reality that neither side had strength enough to finish the war, the Treaty of Jaffa. At last, fatigue and necessity forced the hand of kings, and on September 2nd, 1192, Richard and Saladin met not with swords but with envoys to craft the Treaty of Jaffa, an agreement born not of triumph but of compromise. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, yet Christian pilgrims were guaranteed safe passage and the right to worship at the holy sites, while the Crusaders retained a fragile but vital coastal strip stretching from Tyre to Jaffa, a foothold that preserved the Christian presence in the Levant for another century. Richard, despite his victories, departed without ever seeing Jerusalem, bound for England where his throne and family intrigues awaited him, and on his return journey he fell into captivity, a prisoner of political rivals in Europe. Saladin, too, was nearing his end, and within 6 months of the treaty he died in Damascus, leaving behind an empire fractured among heirs, yet still unbroken by foreign conquest. Thus the Third Crusade closed, not with the capture of the Holy City, but with an uneasy truce between two warriors who had tested each other to the very limits of endurance. The Third Crusade did not achieve its greatest aim, for Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, yet it preserved the survival of the Crusader states, ensured access for pilgrims, and above all gave the medieval world two figures whose names would endure in legend. Richard the Lionheart became the embodiment of knightly valor, his courage, brilliance in battle, and moments of ruthless resolve, making him the archetype of the chivalric king, admired even by enemies. Saladin, by contrast, shone as the mirror image of the ideal Islamic ruler, famed not only for his victories but for his generosity, his faith, and his capacity for mercy, so that even in Europe his death was mourned. Their rivalry was fierce, yet tempered by mutual respect. Richard once sent gifts of fruit and ice to his ailing foe, and Saladin ensured safe passage for Christian pilgrims, even in war. Theirs was a duel of civilizations, of faith and empire, but also of men who recognized greatness in one another. And in that recognition lay the true legacy of the Third Crusade. Not the conquest of a city, but the forging of a legend that still captures the imagination of the world.
Please subscribe.